Welcome to the VIEW Magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. This podcast is part of our Someone's Daughter campaign, the campaign to change the way you see justice. This podcast was recorded during Photo London in September 2021. Photo London is an exceptional art and activism project where world-famous and acclaimed photographers have taken photographs of women who have been involved in the criminal justice system. Some are survivors, some are lawyers, some are activists, and others are leading women in public life who've taken an interest in all of the processes, from charging an arrest, from incarceration to rehabilitation. Today we bring you the second part of 3 of this podcast, included in our Someone's Daughter podcast series. We will continue looking at whether women with lived experience can be part of the solution when it comes to effective policy in stopping the cycle of crime and reducing reoffending. Today's panel includes model and mental health campaigner Naomi Harlow, activist and former prisoner Clare Barstow, prison law solicitor and expert Rob Welsh from our sponsors InstaLaw, a leading prison and criminal defense law firm, and finally, former prisoner and one of the founders of The View, Farah Damji. Thank you all for coming. Rob, we ended the previous part talking about the very important matter of a seeming lack of openness for new alternatives to incarceration. What is your view on this matter?
I think it boils down to political issues and essentially parties wanting to keep and maintain their popularity with the general public, because the reality is there isn't a great deal of sympathy for people in prison and offenders in the general public. Has certainly been my experience in other forums when I've spoken to people. And I think because of that, ultimately, political parties are frightened of losing votes and so forth if they are deemed to be treating inmates, and so forth, leniently, when of course that isn't the reality at all. And that's why these events and talks are so important, to try and educate the wider public as much as anything else, that people do need help and there are other alternatives to prison, and it's not, an easy ride because we are suggesting these alternatives to people. One of the things that crops up with other people I've spoken about a lot is regarding to help people get training in prison and so forth, and qualifications people can undertake. And that's a fundamentally important part of the prison system as I view it. When I've spoken to people about the kind of qualifications some people have attained in prison, they have said to me, well, why should they get the money for those qualifications? I have to pay for that when I'm out. And my answer to that is, well, you don't need the help. It's akin to giving people disability allowance. We give it to people who need it, and the people who need it are the people who have suffered trauma, who are in prison, who need investing in, and that's the only way that we're going to try and help people break this cycle of coming back to prison again and again. But of course, the place, in my view, for that to take place isn't in prison in the first place. They shouldn't be in there. We should be allocating that £40,000 a year that we would have spent keeping people in prison. We should be allocating that to them when they're out of prison, and helping them obtain work or meaningful qualifications to sustain them going forward for years and years. And £40,000 to people would go a very long way if it was given, more directly to them, more entrusted to somebody who was going to use it very wisely. And Naomi made the point that this all comes down to essentially bad planning. And I think it does.
And Claire?
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, I'm part of the an ambassador for the Hardman Trust, and they give grants for education, learning, and skills to prisoners who've done a long sentence. But again, they can only touch a few. And I've been in prison and given talks, and also to the Supreme Court and probation, etc. But I think and going in and giving talks in not just in England but in Scotland too. And I think the issue is that there should be a mandatory, instead of charities having to being able to give a few grants, it should be almost mandatory that somebody is given some money for every prisoner is accessed upon release, so they can access some either equipment for work or training or education in some form that they might need that they can't do inside. I think if that money was earmarked, it would in the long term it would save thousands of pounds, because then they would be less likely to end up back in that situation.
Farah, do you think this is a viable solution?
No, because there will always be issues about the prisoner is using it for something illicit, or there's some fraud going on, or there's something dodgy about it, and then I think there's too many possible kind of bombs in that situation. What I think we need to do is we need to look at. There's a really interesting comment by a lady. I'm sorry, I can't see her name, and she's saying that they're funded to do to provide rehabilitation services. So it costs 2,000, but they're only being given 1,000. So there are some really, really brilliant women's centres that are doing really good work. But my worry about that model is that you extend the carceral estate, you then bring it into the community. If you suddenly give a charity money and control over a prisoner's life and what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to go and report, suddenly you begin to massively increase state surveillance and also the carceral estate. So you bring prison into the community, basically. And I think it's dangerous because some of the women's centres work very closely, not all, I mean, for the most part, I think they're really good and they're really useful. But I think some of them work very, very closely with the Ministry of Justice, and they are not funded sustainably. They have to go cap in hand every single year. Their funding is not on a secure footing. So they have to go every year begging to the Ministry of Justice or the local authority or the police and crime commissioner, seeking finance, in order to sustain what they're doing. And I don't think this is a sustainable way. And then many of them don't allow children. So if you have a child and you have an appointment with your probation officer at a women's centre and you don't show up, you can get recalled. And many of them are quite punitive. And there's this whole thing called pink punishment, where they sort of dress up women's centres to look lovely and it's all glittery and pink and nice inside, but actually they're coercive. You can't force someone to rehabilitate. It's done through desistance, it's done through relationships, it's done through a relational agreement and a contract with society that you want to be a better person, you don't want to do those things again. So I think money could be allocated again in this justice reinvestment model, and preemptive solutions where we're funding things like mental health, parenting classes, cooking classes, for women who are entering the criminal justice system, rather than spending all of the money in this intensive prison intervention that isn't working. So I think there's a danger in. I absolutely agree with Naomi and Rob when you say that the money could be better spent, and not spent in prisons. And absolutely, I mean, there's such a huge shortage of prison psychologists and prison psychiatrists at the moment. It's taking 6 months to even get the referral from the prison GP to see a woman in prison at the moment, and then it's a further 18 months to get any treatment. So that's 2 years of your sentence done before you even see a GP or before you even see a psychiatrist or a mental health expert. So I don't know I think better funded probation services, I think non-coercive women's centres, I think preemptive solutions before people, or just as people are entering the criminal justice system, would be useful. And we also need to look at, here in Ireland, there was a very recent survey about who are the people that are filling up the prisons, what areas, and obviously Ireland's much smaller than England, but they actually did it on kind of a postcode basis. And the people that were filling up the prisons came from the most impoverished areas. So if you put funds directly into those areas, into community centres, into women's centres, into domestic abuse, into understanding trauma, I think you would see a reduction in those people going into the criminal justice system. And that needs to be done. I mean, again, in England, if you look at who's going to prison, it's mostly young Black men and young lower class white men. So we need to look at what's wrong in those communities that those people are making those choices,
And how do you see this working as a way forward with some of your clients, Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, because I've always worked with children and young people, I think if we're going to really strip it back, the work needs to be done with them. So, if you have traumatized children, and I've always said this, that, that whenever I look at an 8-year-old who's refusing to go into the classroom and who is distressed, who's angry, who's lashing out, who comes from a background of deprivation, who doesn't have access to support with their education, so they come to school to educate. We saw that particularly in the pandemic, that gap between the haves and the have-nots was significant. And I'm not just talking about financial haves, I'm talking about parents who can engage with education, parents who are confident enough to teach their children, access to things like laptops so that they can do home learning. I know lots of schools gave out laptops, but there's a limit to how much that they have. And that gap has significantly increased. So if you have a child like that at 8 who is displaying all of these behaviours, there is a stronger likelihood that if nothing is done to support that child at 18, 30, whatever, is going to, and I don't want to say make choices, because I don't feel that it's always a choice. I don't feel that that's always a fair suggestion, really, because choice to me is something you make when you have two equally possible options. A choice is, do I want fish and chips for dinner, or do I want takeaway for dinner? That's a choice. What we're talking about and what I'm talking about with my children, those aren't choices that they're making. Those are primitive, immediate responses to trauma, to fear, to survival. So if we're talking about adult women particularly, who are involved in theft, drugs, prostitution, we're not talking necessarily about choices. We're talking about surviving. And so if we have a system where I always compare it to, obviously we'll all have seen that, the Maslow's hierarchy of need. And if you've got somebody who at the very bottom of that hasn't got food, shelter, and all of those basics met, doesn't have access to money, doesn't have access to always heating, or all of these kind of things. I've worked with so many children who their heating and lighting is done on cards. The card runs out in the middle of the night, and that's it until the next amount of money. That's it. If you have people who don't have those things, we cannot be expecting them to reach the highest point of that, which is this self-actualization, which is being the best version of themselves that they can be, which is being a constructive product of society, contributing and being engaged with the society and the community around them. If we're depriving children, young people and adults of basics, and going up into the next level of emotional support, of hobbies. So many of the children I work with, they don't have hobbies, they don't have things that they do for fun, and the reason that they don't is because there's no money, there's no time, but there's also no emotional room for any of that stuff. So stuff like the things that we all take for granted that children have, like friends, clubs, social life, all of those things, they're too exhausted by all of that. They can't make engaging, meaningful relationships with their peers, because their peers seem quite alien and other to them a lot of the time. If you have two children where one is coming from a 2-parent family where people work, money doesn't really come up as a major issue, there's always food, nobody's shouting, everybody's relatively okay. And I'm not talking about perfect families, I'm talking about fairly normal families. How is a child who's coming from a single parent family, who's on benefits, who's worrying literally about where their next meal comes from, whose parent or guardian might be suffering from depression or substance abuse or any number of other things, how are we expecting those two children to engage with each other? And how are we possibly going to be expecting the same outcomes from one child and this other child? So when we're talking about choice and rehabilitation, it's not helping people, to me, it's not helping people to make a different choice. It's helping people to see that there is a choice in the first place. But we have to give them stuff to be able to make that choice. You can't say to someone, make a choice to be a better person, make a choice to be on this 5th rung where you're contributing to society, because they will come back and say, okay, right, but what am I eating and where am I living? You know, we have to meet people's basic needs, people's mental health and emotional needs, people's ability to connect with the society and the community around them before we can ever expect them to be there. And I think for a lot of the children and young people that I've worked with, what I see already in them is a disconnect from their life and, say, the life of the school. So schools try to foster, even, you know, especially in primary school, foster this idea that we are a school community. But if you have children who don't recognise those people as anything like them, if they feel outside of that, if they feel judged, which they sometimes are, if I'm perfectly honest, how are they going? Why are we expecting them to want to care for the community? Because they're seeing it as a community that judges them, that they're not part of, that they're not welcome in. And when you get down through to adults in that same situation, it's exactly the same thing. They don't feel connected and part of this society. So why would they be making choices to help people who don't like them, who don't understand them, who judge them, who think they're, you know, bottom of the rung? So yeah, I mean, I think rehabilitation has to be there. It has to come with solid actual support in terms of housing, jobs, self-improvement, education. Then we can start talking about choices, because that's to me, that's 3 steps above where we're starting from.
Rob, with your experience of working with women, how do you feel they could be better prepared and supported upon their release?
One of the big things that I've come across in the women's estate and the male estate, for that matter, is reconnecting with family members. It's a bit of a niche area, but there's a lot of people who tend to lose contact with family members and some positive relations during the prison system. And often it seems very simple to us, but they need some help to reignite those relationships. And sometimes it's as straightforward as they've moved, I don't know where they are. And I tend to come across that quite a lot. And I think that could be an important thing for people across the prison estate, to re-establish positive family connections and try and do that in good time before getting out. Because again, quite a lot of the time we see people come out of prison and fall back into the same negative peer groups, and the cycle tends to begin again. So that's something I know there are charities to assist with, but it's something which keeps cropping up in practice again and again and again. And so it's evident to me that people in the prison estate aren't quite aware of the charities and assistance they can get with that.
So do you think there isn't enough access and support for women leaving prisons, for them to know what opportunities may be out there for them?
Very much so. I think there needs to be some more time spent when people enter the estate and before they leave the estate. I know the prison do give flyers and information to people about services with numbers and so on and so forth, but a lot of people struggle with literacy, and it's very difficult for them to understand stuff, and a lot of that gets lost in translation, and just they might as well have not been given it at all. So again, it comes down to this individual focus on people at the start and before they leave, to see what they need specific help with.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think that's maybe something that the probation service could be, you know, and they do, and we do have some really great probation officers, but I've worked with a lot of parents, and if they have, you know, significant levels of like mental health issues, like anxiety, depression, you know, we're not talking, you know, serious psychosis, but we're talking about anxiety and depression and all of those things. The idea that you'd say to somebody who's experiencing that, here's a leaflet for a group, go to it on your own, to these people that you've never met before, this will help you. Even that is quite a massive undertaking for somebody who's feeling really vulnerable. You know, we've all been in a situation where we're struggling with stuff at life, and even like, you know, popping to the shop to get milk, you're like, I just can't face that today. I can't face seeing people. Well, you're asking people to go out and join in with this new thing, you know, and it's a big ask. They almost need someone to go with them for the first time. Like, we are going to this together. We're going to see how this looks. You know, I'm going to be right here, you know, so you'll have someone to talk to. I know these sound like little things, but but it's massive. It makes a massive difference if you have people who will just go with you and hold your hand through the first terrifying steps back into society, if you like.
Farah?
At the end of your sentence, Naomi, you do have a bit of interaction with probation services. They do signpost and they do supposedly, you know, put these things in place, but it's right at the end when you're so traumatized about coming out, as Rob said, those links, making those links with your kids, your family, where am I going to go, what's going to happen to me? It's so badly planned. And all of the national mental health services, all of the court numbers, all of the domestic abuse agencies numbers are actually already on prisoners' PIN phone numbers. They're all there. There's about 300 numbers, but they're not told that. And if you want to make the phone call to Mind or to domestic or to Women's Aid, you're going to be making it in a hallway with women passing you all the time, with officers passing you all the time, and your business is then going to be currency on the wing, because information in prison is currency. So in a very strange way, you know, they'll turn around to you and say, well, they can call Mind, they can call Women's Aid, they can call the National Domestic Abuse Line. But the way that that's set up without the information actually being passed on properly, again, it's sort of an obstacle, isn't it? And it's very hard to have, as you said, to make that first step and make that call, and then to have the whole world listening and knowing that everyone's going to know how you're feeling and everything is really hard. But I think this whole idea of, there's a lot of talk of peer mentors now in prison who can actually kind of guide you through the first induction days, but there's not much information about it at the moment.
Naomi, just taking it back to the theme of this talk, do you think women with lived experience have a place in this conversation? Do you think women like Farah and Clare have anything to offer towards the transformation of the justice system?
Massively. As I said right at the beginning, I haven't been through the criminal justice system myself, but I have lived through sort of similar traumas to the ones that I'm talking about in terms of, you know, growing up in poverty and all of those things. And what I noticed, and as I said at the beginning, I think if you have resolved some of those issues within yourself, if you have access to not never separating them from your practice, but being aware of how they might influence your practice, some of the most compassionate and committed people that I've ever worked with are people who've lived through it already. Because what you'll find again and again when you talk to people like that is, and I always keep it in the back of my head when I'm working with children and young people, is you know, be the person that you needed, be the adult that you needed when you were a child. And so I do take that with me, if nothing else. And what every child would need is to be listened to be heard, to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel wanted, to feel like we're doing this together. This is us together. We will sort this out. You don't have to do it by yourself. And I think if we look at adults with mental health, I run a mental health group online, and those adults and the things that they are frightened of aren't that different to the things that children are frightened of. We all have times where we feel vulnerable and that we just want somebody to come in and say, do you know what, I'm here, what do you need, we'll sort this out together, I will come with you, I'll hold your hand. And I think that is the part that people who don't have experience of trauma don't necessarily always see. That the very basic things like feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling connected, the understanding that you and Claire would have of all the fear that you have coming out of prison, all of the many things that are weighing on your mind about reconnecting, about how people are going to see you, about how judged you feel, about how you're going to rebuild from the ground up. All of these things that you would fear are the nuances of trauma that I think people who haven't experienced it don't see and miss a lot of the time. So I think not only do they have a place, I think it's absolutely vital to have those people involved in it, because apart from anything else, if somebody comes to you and says, I don't know your experience, but I know my experience, and this is what I need, this is what I needed, what do you need? That feels so different than, okay, well, I'm a professional and I've had this training and I'm telling you this is what we're doing, this is what you need. That's a very different dynamic. So I think it's absolutely vital that people who understand the system and people who understand the feelings that come from it are involved in the rehabilitation process for other women. Absolutely.
And Rob, do you think there should be more experts by experience to help guide women upon release, employed by the Ministry of Justice, for example, or connected with charities or probation?
I think it's absolutely imperative, and people who have been through the experience are arguably our greatest asset in being able to A, understand, and B, come up with a solution to problems that exist. And in any walk of life, the people who have been through the experience are invaluable, absolutely invaluable in any business, in any form. And I would like to see the Ministry of Justice get more involved with people who have been through the system and understand the system better. They do it in other areas and consult with people in other areas of business who have experience. So, for example, they are currently asking me about Rule 39 post and how to improve the system, stuff like that, because I'm involved in it. They should be extending that to people who have been through the prison system, certainly. And it would be fantastic if further opportunities could be made available in terms of support for other inmates who come out of the system. And it's, as everybody has said, and I think we're all in agreement, it's absolutely invaluable that people who have been through the system are able to properly contribute, and they are actually listened to, because there's no doubt their views will be more valuable than anybody else's. That's certainly my opinion.
Oh, thank you so much, Rob, and all the other panelists. This brings to a close our second part of 3 of this podcast, included in our Someone's Daughter podcast series. A discussion today which has been about the role of women who have lived experience and may be a part of the solution to the entrenched problems of reoffending and crime. So stay tuned for the next part of this podcast coming next week. Thank you so much, Naomi Harlow, Rob Walsh, Farah Damji, and Clare Barstow. The View would also like to thank leading law firm Instalaw and Guernica 37 Legal Chambers for their sponsorship and support of Someone's Daughter, experts in prison law and human rights, defending the rights of people across the world. You can go online and search for Someone's Daughter to see powerful women photographed by world-renowned and acclaimed photographers, read their stories in the VIEW magazine, and be inspired by these very shocking narratives, but also by these excellent constructive solutions. I'm Madalena Alberto, and this Rebel podcast is a production of the VIEW Magazine. You can find the VIEW Magazine across our social media, where we are Rebel Justice. The VIEW Magazine is available online via subscription and as a digital download on the viewmag.org.uk. Support, amplify, donate.